Welcome to Butch's Building Blocks. Let's make something beautiful today. I have this piece of curly black walnut. It is magnificent. It looks extremely beautiful. The only problem is, on this side it narrows out. So this was a slab taken off the outside edge of the tree. My plan is to cut this section off, split it down the middle, and then make an epoxy cutting board out of it. I have aligned the blade and drawn a pencil mark so that I could see where I was going to cut. I want to make sure that I save this. I'm going to dig that out, clean it out. That will also get blue epoxy. That will be my pond next to the river. Our black walnut has been cut in half. We now have 11 by 16 inches. I'm going to have to clean this up and sand it off so that we get good adhesion with our epoxy. And I'll have to do the same for this side. I've finished sanding, cleaned off the surface so that it was pretty much bark free, definitely. There was some little pockets that I didn't want to take out because I didn't want to ruin the texture of the wood. Also cleaned out all the dead wood and my bark from my pond. And then again sanded this side nice and smooth. Our next step is to build a frame so that we have some place to pour the epoxy. Our frame is built to hold our pieces in place. Now I need to get some packing tape and layer it underneath so my epoxy does not stick to my wood. These are the two pieces that we're going to be using in our epoxy cutting board. Because we're going to be using a blue pigment, I have coated them with clear epoxy resin to preserve the color of the black walnut. I'm going to use this piece of 1/4 inch plywood as the base for my epoxy frame. I'm going to take packing tape, cover the entire frame, and I'll put my upper frame on it and use some kitchen and bath 100% clear silicone to caulk all of the edges and the corners to see if we can stop any epoxy leaks. The frame for our epoxy river cutting board is finished. I've siliconized all the edges and the corners. I screwed down the top piece so that it's nice and tight. Put another bead of silicone on the outside edge. The silicone caulk that I put in here in order to keep everything from leaking has had 12 hours to dry. A little more than probably is necessary, but it's always better to be sure that it's dry than not. Our two pieces of black walnut are set in place. Now we're going to put a block and a clamp over top of each piece of wood. The density of wood is less than that of the epoxy, so the wood will float if you don't hold it in place. Remember to wrap your block or whatever you use in packing tape. Otherwise, if the epoxy gets on it, it will stick to your piece of wood, and then you have a lot of trouble. For this pour, I'm going to be using Caribbean blue and iridescent blue to give it a little dazzle. I'm gonna mix these up since it takes about 5 minutes to mix before we can even pour. After I get it all mixed up, we'll pour it in together. I don't have a deep pour right now, so we'll have to do this in 2 stages. I've been mixing our epoxy now for a little over 7 minutes. It should be fairly uniform. The hardener should be in there. I put in both the 2 colors. Let's pour away and see what we get. That looks very, very pretty. Like I said, I don't have a deep pour, so I'm gonna have to do this in 2 stages, but that's okay. We'll let some of those bubbles rise. When they do, I have a torch and I will surface pop them. This is what our epoxy river cutting board looks like. I had to put 4 different layers of epoxy in here, only because my deep pour seems to be lost in the mail. At this point in time, what I need to do is to unscrew and pull the sides off. Once I do that, we'll take a look at it again. In my rush, I forgot to tape the wooden sides. Now the epoxy is adhered to these sides pretty strong. I'm gonna have to take this out to my table saw and cut these sides off. Well, it's not the best way to get it off, but certainly works. Got a little bit of cleanup to do on it. But like I said, I'm gonna have to square the edges in. Started to sand my epoxy cutting board. Started at 80 grit, went to 120. I found that I had several bubbles in my board, which I didn't like. In order to get nice clean pockets for my epoxy to go back into them, I actually used a drill bit and have drilled them out. Not terribly deep, but just deep enough to pop the bubbles, to say. And now we will take and put a thin coat of epoxy over top of each of those bubbles and resand it back down again. With multiple holes, I have mixed up a small 10-gram batch of epoxy with some pigment. I'm going to fill these holes and then take this rubber scraper and smooth it out as best I can. I'm going to add some more to these just because they're over top of raw wood, and epoxy has a tendency to settle down into wood. Okay, as much as I'd like to continue messing with it, I think I'm just going to stop at this point and wait for the epoxy to cure and see what happens. I'm going to add some more to these just because they're over top of raw wood, and epoxy has a tendency to settle down into wood. Okay, as much as I'd like to continue messing with it, I think I'm just going to stop at this point and wait for the... This is the epoxy board after I've sanded it. You can definitely see the spots that I redid when I drilled them out and put new epoxy on it. But watch what happens when we wipe it clean. When we wipe it clean, the spots pretty well disappear. You can still see them a little bit. You can still see where I've got some pinholes here. For my first epoxy cutting board, I've made a lot of mistakes and I've learned an awful lot. It doesn't look bad at all, even after I've filled it with epoxy drill holes like I did on the other side. This one came out much cleaner. There were much fewer tiny bubbles in it than on the other side. Even though the epoxy board didn't turn out spectacular, I still think we need to pour a little bit of oil on it to see what it looks like anyways. It's not a bad epoxy board. Doesn't look too bad considering all the mistakes that were made. It's a time in every project where you look at return of effort compared to what you're going to get out. And this cutting board has got to the point where I believe I've learned as much as I can from it. Well, for my first epoxy cutting board, came out okay. What can we say? We all make mistakes. Although they're mistakes, I still managed to recover something that is semi-usable, certainly not for sale. If I had to pick one mistake that I made throughout the whole thing, it would probably be that at the beginning I was impatient. I did not wait for my deep pour epoxy. That was the key issue that caused everything else that followed. Well, I hope you've enjoyed watching me struggle with this epoxy cutting board, and I hope you certainly don't make the same mistakes that I did.